afternoon. Welcome back everyone to the NPTEL online certification course Tribal Studies in India, Interdisciplinary Perspectives and Approaches. Today we are going to do our lecture number 54 titled Social Movements, and we are going to specifically focus on environmental movements. Now in the last two classes we tried to really understand the conceptual foundations of social movements, and if you recall we tried to we have this general acceptance or understanding that it is very difficult to give a singular definition of what social movements are, because within the social movements you can have a lot of movements. You can have one environmental movements that we are going to study now. You can have ethnic movements, you can have farmers movement, you can have peasant movements, you can have women's movements, you can have movements related to human rights or rights based movements. So you can have political movements, you can have religious movements, so on and so forth. So therefore the common foundation that we have understood in the last class is that social movements is a very broad category, but this does not mean that we should not have a conceptual understanding of what social movements are. Now a movement can be called a social movement when they have certain common characteristics, such as the movements are collective in nature, in a sense that not a single one, if one person is starting a movement, that essentially cannot be called a social movement. So in social movement you will always see a group of people coming together with sharing the same kind of agenda or sharing the same kind of discontentment around which they began to mobilize themselves. Now they will have some kind of agenda or objective, they will follow some kind of strategies. Sometimes the movement can be violent, sometimes the movement can be non-violent as well, and they will have certain kind of objectives. That objectives can be short term, that objectives can be long term as well. So in that kind of context, one has to really understand that social movements comes in different forms and different shades, and some movements can be very institutionalized, in a sense that there is a clear organizational structure in the movements. Some movements can be very non-institutionalized, in the sense that there is no clear hierarchy within the movement. So in continuation to what we have studied in the last two lectures, a very important part a very important part of why we talk about and study social movements is that many of the things that we learn, many of the things that we have as a person, as a citizen of this country or anyone in the world, many of the rights that we have today are outcome of social movements at times. I am not saying that all the rights that we have, say for instance in India, under the Constitution of India, essentially a product of or a byproduct of social movements. That is not my point. But then many of the things, the rights that we have, for instance, this is just an example, are an outcome of social movements, and we have talked about it, right to education, right to information, right to health. All these things are associated strongly with social movements. So a very important part of contemporary social movements landscape is environmental movements. Now in the last class we have briefly tried to understand the context of environmental movements, and in today's lecture we will continue doing that, where we will look at different typologies given by scholars in terms of categorizing the different types of environmental movements, particularly in the context of India, and also the kind of how much of the movements that we see in tribal communities address the questions of environment. Now when it comes to the study of environment in India, there are two very prominent scholars that we cannot ignore. One is Ramachandra Guha and the other is Madhav Gadgil. Now both of these scholars have extensively studied the question of environment and ecology in India, and their scholarships have actually built the foundation of environmental studies. Now for Guha and Gadgil, environmental movements are aimed at encouraging the responsible and sustainable use of natural resources, preventing environmental damage and helping restore damaged ecosystems. Now a very important, beyond the definition that I just read out, a very important significant contribution by Guha particularly, Ramachandra Guha particularly, is that we tend to have this assumption that environmental or people who are literate, people who are educated, people who live in the urban are only the one who are deeply concerned about the environment. But what Guha actually have shown in his work is that even the poor people in India are deeply concerned about the environment, particularly poor people or ordinary people who are dependent on natural resources for their livelihoods. And Guha have extensively studied environmental movements in the state of Uttarakhand, and he specifically talks about environmentalism of the poor. So, therefore, it is important to acknowledge that the question of environmental consciousness is not a consciousness of the urban educated middle class, but in India the poor, the working class, the illiterate, the ordinary people are also deeply concerned about the environment. In Western countries, most of the time environmental movements are focused on reducing consumption and protecting resources through conservation, but in India it tends to revolve around the utilization of natural resources as well as their control. So, a very important figure again when one talks about environmental movements or environment in India is Vandana Shiva, and along with Jayanta Bandyopadhyay, Vandana Shiva, they note that in post-independent India, environmental movements emerged largely in the context of the harmful exploitation of natural resources, which is mainly driven by capitalist model of development, or what they call a development that prioritize market interests. Now, in the last 50 to 60 years, you will see that there has been incessant exploitation of natural resources, and often this resulted into ecological damage, at times irreparable ecological damage. Now, this has comes in different forms in terms of coal mining, oil mining, or extraction of natural resources, cutting down of forests, utilization of land for agricultural land, for instance, for industrial purpose, so on and so forth. So, what Jayanta Bandyopadhyay and Vandana Shiva essentially note is that these environmental movements in India that we see are essentially emerged in response to the kind of developmental activities or developmental models that we follow in the country. So, therefore, they argue that Indian environmental movements in India are a reflection of about the destruction of two essential systems. One is the natural ecological processes, and the second is the economy of survival for the poor. So, a scholar by the name Harsh Sethi divides environmental struggles into three broad types based on how environmental issues are perceived. The first is movements that focus on political and economic aspects, particularly on the rights of people and how resources are shared. The second group deals with specific environmental problems and looks for solutions within the current system, such as using new technologies or changing laws and policies. The third is that movements that question the model of development that we follow. Now, in the case of the first, for instance, the political and economic aspects, particularly on the rights of people. Now, you can see that in India, the question of environmental damage is something which is very important, because you have in India we have a lot of people who are directly dependent on natural resources for their livelihoods. Whether it is communities who are living in the coastal regions, whether they are pastoralist communities, whether they are communities who are directly dependent on land. For instance, India is still a very much an agrarian society, where we have close to 60 to 70% of the total population who are directly or indirectly dependent on agriculture and allied activities. Now, for these people, land is their only asset, and therefore the moment you destroy land, for instance land resources or forest resources, then it means that it affects their right, it affects their well-being. So, by which there are movements that specifically foreground itself on the question of environmental movements as rights based movement. Second is that there are also movements that looks at solutions in terms of technological advancement, where the belief is that if we use sustainable technology or use technology in a sustainable manner, it can potentially reduce or mitigate environmental problems. Now, further to what we have talked about in the last slides, Sethi also breaks down environmental struggles into 5 main types. One is what he calls the forest related issues, and this is a very important issue when we talk about tribal communities, because if you recall we have already extensively engaged with why forest is so much central in the lives of tribal communities, and even till today we have more than 70 to 75% of India's tribal communities who are dependent on forests. So, therefore, it is not surprising to know that forest related issues or forest rights is a matter of big concern for tribal communities, and these forest related issues mostly concerned with protests against forest policies and the way forest resources are used or managed. Now, up until the colonial rule, communities more or less have free access to forest resources, but with the coming of the British, what we began to witness is that forest rights are being deprived. Local communities are being removed from forest regions, and the colonial state began to utilize forest resources and commercially exploit them. it means that the local people who have been living and depending on the forest for their everyday survival are no longer allowed to have even access to these resources, for which there are a lot of protests, there are a lot of movements against forest policies. The second is land use problems, and this pertains to negative impacts because of industrialization, the shrinking of farmland, overuse of chemical fertilizers and pesticides, soil damage, waterlogging and mining activities. Now, a very important part that we are seeing today because of say the rapid urbanization or the acceleration of industrialization in India is that many of the agricultural lands are being diverted to non-agricultural purposes, and we have seen that in major cities in India. For example, in Delhi we have seen how the expansion of Delhi resulted in the conversion of agricultural land into non-agricultural land, for non-agricultural use. Likewise, we have also seen the overuse of chemical fertilizers to increase productivity, and this we have seen it say for example in states like Punjab. So therefore, all this all these issues have some side effects in terms of health, but at the same time it also have long term implications in terms of soil fertility. The third kind of type that SETI talks about is the opposition to large dams. Now, India, as it is very important for India to construct large dams, right, to exploit its its water resources, and there are so many rivers, or what India is very rich in terms of any natural resources, and definitely water is one among them. Now, even if you look at global statistics today, India stands third, is the third country when it comes to the construction of hydropower dams. Now, we have United States and China who are at the number 1 and number 2 positions, and India comes third. But many a times what we also see is that the construction of hydropower projects have adverse consequences for the people who are being displaced, and this essentially also happen because the kind of rehabilitation policies that we follow have not really benefited the people who are being displaced, nor the kind of developmental initiatives that are being undertaken have not the benefits of such developmental initiatives does not necessarily percolate down to the people who are being affected by the construction of the dams. Now, since dams also resulted in the submergence of vast amounts of land, vast amount of forest resources, many a times there is a strong environmental angle to the opposition of the construction of dams. The fourth types that SETI talks about is industrial pollution, and this essentially it's very clear, right, industrial pollution, what these kind of movements aim to address is basically reducing the kind of pollution from factories and other industries. The last is marine resource exploitation, which again is a very important issue, particularly even for a country like India with with a long coastal regions. The question of marine resources is very important, because at least we have 50 to 70 million people who are directly dependent on for example on fishing, by which it makes it very important to maintain ecological balance, but also ensure that our natural resources are not overexploited. So therefore, this kind of movements essentially oppose the excessive and harmful use of ocean resources for like overfishing. So coming back to Guha and Gadgil again, they classified environmental movements based on the participation, basically based on the people who are part of the movements, and using this criteria they identify three types of participants. One they call the omnivores. Omnivores are the one who have access to many resources. The ecosystem people who are directly dependent on nature for their survival. For example, like I said, forest dependent communities, or people who are entirely dependent on ocean resources because they are entirely dependent on fishing, for example, for their everyday survival. And the third is ecological refugees, people who are displaced because of environmental damage or developmental projects. Sometimes we also use climate refugees to really capture that many communities all over the world are facing a lot of threat, or sometimes a threat in terms of extinction, particularly island countries. You will see that they are gradually becoming climate refugees because islands are shrinking and they have to look out for a new place to stay or a new place to live. So in India also, climate change is going to have significant impact for people who are living in coastal regions, people who are living the peak in areas which have high temperatures, which will essentially result into what Guha and Gadgil call ecological refugees. Now, Guha and Gadgil further argues that environmental movements in India today are mainly concerned with justice and fairness for the poor by emphasizing the need to protect the environment so that it support the survival and rights of the marginalized communities. So, today the environmental discourse in India, the environmental movements discourse in India that we essentially have is today integrally embedded within the discourse of justice and rights, in a sense that it should address the questions of socio-economic inequalities by giving emphasis on the kind of implications or the kind of rights that are associated particularly with the poor people. So, protecting the environment also should result into protecting the interests of the poor people who are dependent on natural resources. So, a very important scholar that we have constantly discuss and talk about in this series of lecture is K.S. Singh, who have done a lot of work on the issue of tribal communities in India. Now, K.S. Singh actually tries to capture the changing nature of social movements. Like I said, social movements, some social movements last for 2 months, some social movement lasts for 4 months, some movements can go on for 2 years, 3 years, 10 years, so on and so forth. So, some movements can die down for some time and then can re-emerge, So, therefore, social and the environmental movements are also not always the same. What was environmental issue in the 1960s and the 1970s may no longer be an issue today. But then, so therefore, it is also important to understand that social movements, the kind of questions that these movements are raising are also different over a period of time. So, in that context, the observation of K.S. Singh on the changing nature of social movements is very, very important. So, since this is a quote, I am just going to read it out. In recent years, with the rise of the international movement of indigenous people in the postmodernist phase, the focus has shifted to self-determination or self-management of the resources, identity and ethnicity. The environmental movements has focused on communities in situ, their relationship to resources, their rapport with nature, their worldview. Therefore, with a growing concern for environment, particularly biodiversity, pluralism, ethnicity and identity, all are now interrelated. The tribal movements are assuming a new character. They are all now becoming more and more identity based movements with various issues concerning control over resources, etc., being considered as ramifications of this central issue. Now, from the 1980s onwards, what K.S. Singh actually is saying here is that there is this changing phase of social movements, and initially social movements have a very, very broad based character in terms of the nature of participants, but over a period of time what we are seeing is that environmental movements are also becoming integrally linked to the issue of identity or the issue of ethnicity. And today movements even within environmental discourse have strongly taken into consideration the questions of identity, and by which K.S. Singh is saying that tribal movements in India are taking a new character. They are changing their phase in response to the larger global change that is happening in terms of how the issue of indigeneity or indigenous rights is being globalized at the international level, and this globalization of indigenous rights have strong national ramifications even in India, where tribal communities in particular have asserted and claimed this idea of being indigenous. So, therefore, what K. Singh is saying is that in the last part of this quote, they are becoming more and more identity based movements with various issues concerning control over resources being considered as ramifications of this central issue. So, the question of identity is taking center stage in the context of social movements, particularly when one looks at tribal movements in contemporary India. Now, in India, we have India have a very rich history of environmental movements, and it is impossible to talk about all the movements. So, in the later part of this presentation, we will specifically look at two movements which are very, very significant. Now, before that, some of the very renowned movements that we have seen in India are: one is the opposition to the construction of Hirakud Dam, the Chipko movement, which is in Uttarakhand, where villagers, especially women, embrace trees to stop deforestation. The third is campaigns like Save the Bhagirathi River and Stop the Tehri Dam in Uttar Pradesh, now in Uttarakhand. The Narmada Bachao Andolan in Madhya Pradesh and Gujarat, which protested against large dam displacing people. Protests against mining in Gandamardhan Hills in Odisha. The Apiko movement in Karnataka's Western Ghats, inspired by Chipko. Resistance to the Silent Valley hydroelectric project in Kerala to protect a rare rainforest. Local opposition to the Gumti Dam in Tripura. Now, all of these movements may achieve their objective or may not even achieve their objective. But then what it does shows is that there is a strong environmental consciousness all over India, where people are deeply concerned about the environment, because it is a question about the survival of human itself. So therefore, these movements at a very broader level reflect the growing public awareness and collective efforts to defend natural ecosystems and the rights of vulnerable communities. So we will quickly run through some some of the prominent movements here, just to contextualize whatever we have said conceptually. Now the first is the Hirakud Dam movement. So all of us know that at the dawn of independence, there is this very famous saying by our first Prime Minister Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, who says that dams are temples of modern India. So Nehru was a firm believer in the idea of scientific progress, and he strongly believes that the future of India lies in science and technological advancement. And for that he sees that the construction of large dams as symbols of India's modernity. So Hirakud Dam was conceived as a symbol of modernity for India, which will take India forward. So therefore, the Hirakud Dam in India at least occupies a very important place in the nationalist imagination of what post-colonial Indian state or a modern state would look like in the future. So the Hirakud Dam, India's first major multi-purpose river valley project after independence, it faced strong resistance from the local population when its construction was announced. And why do people do this? Why do people resist it against the move or resisted or oppose the construction of the dam? The plan was claimed that the dam would protect the fertile and densely populated coastal area of Odisha from flooding. However, when the government issued its first notice to acquire land in 95 villages, protests began in Sambalpur, the area most affected by displacement. So the construction of dam does have a lot of benefits for generation of power and electricity, for irrigating fields, and many other associated benefits. But then the local communities often are very skeptic about the benefits that the construction of dam would result, but also because people tend to have a lot of emotional attachment to their homes, to their lands, to their villages, and they cannot think of the need to being resettling in a new place, in a new home, right. So for which there are a lot of opposition against the construction of dam. People may not be opposing dam per se, but they may oppose being displaced from their homes. The project was also opposed by M.G. Rangaya, a former chief engineer of Mysore. He warned that the dam could harm Odisha's economy because there was no proper analysis of the project costs and benefits. In May 1947, there was a very strong civil obedience movement which was launched in Sambalpur by Dhanadhar Pujari and his wife Kamala Devi, and soon after they were arrested on the first day of the protest itself, and then the government quickly put an end to the movement. Now a very other important movement which which continues to be widely studied by social scientists and scientists alike is the Chipko movement. Now the Chipko movement is a very unique movement in the sense that its impact was not only felt in the state of UP, but also all over the world, where the movement becomes very important reminder of how poor people also deeply feel and think about the environment. So the Chipko movement was a non-violent environmental movement that began in the early 1970s in the Garhwal region of Uttarakhand. And like I said, there is no denying that it is one of the most well-known movements in India, where villagers, especially women, hug trees to stop them from being cut down by contractors. And the word Chipko here means to hug in Hindi, symbolizing how the villagers cling to the trees to protect them. So there was this dissatisfaction and resentment against the attempt to cut trees, by which the local women in Garhwal region of Uttarakhand began to hug trees, essentially symbolizing a resistance, or sending the message that these trees should not only be cut, but they wanted to protect them, right. So they are ready to give to sacrifice themselves to protect the trees. The forests in the Himalayan region were being heavily exploited by private contractors for timber. Local communities depended on the forest for the daily needs like firewood, fodder and small timber for tools and homes. Now, if some of you have come to the state of Uttarakhand, you will see that Uttarakhand have a very beautiful vegetation, is very forested, and very important. This ecology is very important for the sustenance of the everyday life of the people. Now, deforestation would have adverse consequences for their for their everyday survival, because people are dependent for to meet their everyday needs like firewood, fodder and small timber from the forest. So, many a times the local villagers found that they were being denied access, while contractors were allowed large scale commercial felling, and this resulted into huge ecological damage, causing landslides, soil erosion and water scarcity in the region. In 1973, a group of villagers in the Chamoli district came to know that trees in their nearby forests were marked for cutting, and local women, it was here that local women led by Gauri Devi organized a protest and stood around the trees, refusing to cut the trees, because it means that even if cutting of the forest may not directly impact the people, but it have direct consequence for their everyday survival, and for which women come out in large numbers and start hugging the trees, so that sending the message that they do not permit or they will not allow the trees to be cut. So, Chandi Prasad Bhatt and Sundarlal Bahuguna, two Gandhian activists, gave the movement national and international recognition. So, like I said, Chipko movement was not only limited to the state of Uttarakhand, it have global ramifications. The message of Chipko went far and wide, where it inspired many other environmental movements, and Bahuguna himself spread awareness about his food marches and dialogue with policymakers, and the movement gained national attention and led to the ban on commercial felling of trees in the Himalayan region by the Indian government in 1980. So, sometimes movements succeed, sometimes they do not succeed, but more or less, at least in the context of environmental movements, what one can say is that there is a strong consciousness even among local people, illiterate people, people who live in remote and difficult terrains. There is still a very strong ecological or environmental consciousness, because people also deeply feel about the environment. So, another movement which is very important, at least in the context of India, is the Narmada Bachao Andolan. Now, the Narmada Bachao movement began in the 1980s to fight essentially for the demanding proper rehabilitation for people who were to be displaced due to the construction of the Sardar Sarovar Dam. Now, a very known figure who have become widely popular because of the Narmada Bachao movement is Medha Patikar, and under her leadership several protests were organized, and this came to be known as Narmada Bachao Andolan, or Save the Narmada River. So, like the Chipko movement, the Narmada Bachao movement also gained international recognition, and there has been a lot of conversations happening on the question of rehabilitation, on the question of developmental models that we are following in terms of how far we care about our environment. So, such kind of questions were raised by the the Narmada Bachao movement, and like I said, whether they succeed or not is a different matter, but the question here is that how people actually collectively mobilize themselves and raising pertinent issues concerning the environment. So, protesters refused to cooperate with authorities, stopped project work and declined to leave their homes and villages. Though it began with the Narmada dams, the movement, like I said, has a global or a national impact. It helped stop the Rathongchu project in Sikkim in 1997 and the Beti project 1998, and it also resulted into a strong protest which forced the government to review rehabilitation plans for other mega projects like Teri Dam and the Koel Karo project. So, the movement forced both the central and state governments as well as financial institutions like the World Bank to reconsider policies on development, displacement and rehabilitation. Now, in this lecture we have covered quite a lot in terms of trying to understand the conceptual foundation pertaining to environmental movements, and like the typology that we have done in the last lectures in terms of tribal movements, that how there are different types of tribal movements. In environmental movements also you can see that environmental movements does not come in one forms. There are multiple types, there are different types of environmental movements. Some movements are related to land, some movements are related to water, air pollution, some movements are related to specifically to forests. So therefore it comes in different forms, it comes in different states, and the kind of questions they ask are essentially also different. So in that kind of context, it is important to really have a good grasp of or a holistic understanding of what constitute environmental movements in India, and how over a period of time they have they have initiated conversations about the importance of taking into consideration the question of environment when we are pursuing development. So, in these environmental movements, it is the tribal communities who have contributed significantly in terms of mobilizing themselves, in terms of raising the kind of issues in whether it is the question of compensation, whether it is the question of rehabilitation, or whether it is the question of the problems associated with the kind of development models that we follow. So, I am going to stop here, and thank you so much.